Eric, thank you so much for a very, very kind introduction. And I will say it is a particular pleasure to see your leadership at the center. You bring us together today. The center has done so much of the convening to have the conversations that matter about housing, but it's particularly gratifying to me to see your leadership. The Joint Center is the place that really nurtured my own love of housing at a very, very early stage as I was in school thinking about where to go and what to do. And it's just a great pleasure to see where you've taken the center and how great your leadership is there. So thank you for everything that you do every day. You're also sitting next to Julia Stash, who has been a real mentor and friend for so many years, personally, but also through MacArthur. And I think we can all recognize that just as we would say about the Joint Center, if it wasn't for the leadership of the MacArthur Foundation, rental housing would be at a very different place today than it is. The leadership at the state and local level that's been nurtured at the nonprofit level, and increasingly, I hope, at the federal level, driven by your friendship, your leadership for rental housing. I think this is the fourth job in which I have been able to work so closely and directly with the foundation. So thank you, Julia, for everything that you do, and thank you to MacArthur. So this is the section of the speech where a HUD secretary would traditionally explain to you all why rental housing is so important, talk about how the fact that we all rent at some point in our lives, typically at the beginning, when we're facing an empty nest, talk to you about how great it is that we have an Obama administration that is talking about rental housing and is actually engaged in these subjects. The truth is, with this room, with this group of people, looking around and seeing so many faces that I've worked closely with for so many years, I'm going to dispense with that part of the speech and go directly to pick up on a point that I think Eric made, but only briefly, and I want to delve into that for a moment. We have all been talking about rental housing for a long time. Its importance, why the nation needs to be more focused on it. The remarkable thing about this moment that we're in right now is that the conversation we're having in this room is also happening outside of this room. It's a conversation that is happening nationally, on streets, at delis in the morning. You can tell I'm a New Yorker. It is happening everywhere in our country right now as we think about and reflect on what this country has been through the last few years. And the most obvious reason for that, that rental housing is now part of a national debate, is, of course, first and foremost, the lessons that we've learned from this historic economic crisis that we've been through. But it's not the only reason, and I really want to talk about three fundamental reasons why I think we stand at a time, we gather together at a moment where the conversations that we've all had for many years, now we have an opportunity to expand to a national platform, to a national discussion, and hopefully to national action on a number of fronts. I'd mentioned the financial crisis, and you all know the facts. $6 trillion in lost equity. And I think in particular, not just the devastating impact that it's had on families and on entire communities, but also as we work to add jobs to this economy, to bring the economy back more broadly, the fundamental link that we understand, the power of the American economy and how labor mobility has been such an important distinguishing advantage that the American economy has had. Our ability, the willingness, the ability of families to move, to follow jobs, to have our economy evolve in that way is a powerful part of what has made the American economy so strong for decades. And at a point where we have more than 11 million mortgages in negative equity, 1 in 5 mortgages, that has been a significant constraining factor on our ability to have greater the labor mobility that we've been used to and to help our economy. And so the economic crisis is clearly something that has changed the conversation nationally. But as the report from the Joint Center reminds us today, we also have not just a consistent decades-long struggle for renters to afford housing, and particularly the lowest income renters, but that has been exacerbated by this crisis. And that is often counterintuitive, and I think that's an important part of the story. We do hear often, well, we've got too much housing in this country. And certainly rents went down, vacancy rates went up overall in the rental market initially. I think the Joint Center report is important in showing us that that trend has begun to reverse and that we are seeing vacancy rates come down significantly, rents outpacing inflation again. But I think in particular, what that misses is a number of factors about the rental market that are incredibly important, and I know that you've begun to discuss today. First of all, we clearly have a growing affordability gap for the lowest income, and there was not that phenomenon that I talked about in the rental market more broadly that happened for the lowest income. We've had a deepening, worsening shortage in affordable rental housing for the lowest income. And our worst case needs study, which HUD has done consistently for more than a quarter century now, put this in very, very stark terms. The number of households who paid more than half of their income for rent, lived in severely substandard housing, or both, grew by nearly 1.2 million, or 20%, in just the 2 years between 2007 and 2009. We also saw direct links between that phenomenon, the increased numbers, and documented those, the connection to the crisis that we've been through. And so as we puzzle through this, I heard there was a lively discussion earlier about the factors driving this. We shouldn't lose sight of what we know is that this need has increased dramatically. And while it was increasing over the last, as the Joint Center report says, over the last 5 decades, it is clearly accelerated through this crisis. But it's not just that we don't have enough rental housing for the lowest income. It's also that we don't have enough rental housing in the right places nationally. Ed Glazer and a number of others have argued that as the advantages to being located in dense places through higher wages, lower costs of transportation have accelerated with our geographic patterns over the last couple decades, we have seen capital flows begin to recognize that. And I think this has not only been accelerated by the economic crisis that we've seen, but the awareness of observers of the housing market to this phenomenon is important as well. The truth is that the places that have been hardest hit in this crisis have been the places that were least connected to transportation, least connected to schools, least connected to all of the pieces that make up what I would describe as sustainable, strong communities. Just one study I would cite there. There has been a 25% greater value in homes in the Dallas area where those homes are close to transit. So all prices have dropped. Those homes that have been closest to transit have held on to their value by 25% more than those homes that are disconnected farther away from transit. And that is a pattern that we've seen repeated in metro areas across this country. So focusing not just on the need for more rental housing, but the need for rental housing, particularly in places where we have the benefits of the lower costs being located close to transit. Think about the fact that the average American family today spends 52 cents of every dollar they earn just on housing and transportation combined, those two expenses alone. And you begin to understand how powerful the effects of the connection between the location of housing relative to transit are. And then finally, if all of these trends on the low income, on the geographical dispersion of our rental housing weren't important enough, the Joint Center reminds us very clearly that these trends will only accelerate in the years to come. As we think about the demographics, in 20 years, more than 70 million Americans will have reached retirement age, and the senior population will have doubled by 2040. But in addition, as we look at the household formation of young families, as we look at the pattern of demographics in race and ethnicity across the country, the expectation that the Joint Center study lays out is that the number of renters will grow by between 3.8 and 5 million between 2011 and just 2020. So this is not the distant future. This is the near future that will continue to raise the importance of rental housing within our national housing policy. The third and final point that I would make about why this moment is so important is that this fiscal climate that we are facing poses great risks, but I also think great opportunities for us as we look at what is in front of us. You all know that the low-income housing tax credit, for example, has been the most critical tool in building and preserving rental housing over the last quarter century. Fully half of all multifamily starts in the 90s were from the tax credit. And yet, as we have a broader conversation about tax policy, we also have to recognize that the low-income housing tax credit is the third largest corporate deduction, only behind the manufacturing deduction and the R&D tax credit is the low-income housing tax credit. And so while we, I think all of us that care about rental housing, there clearly will be an urge to play defense and to figure out how we maintain the investment of the tax credit. I would also urge all of you to make sure that we are thinking about the opportunities that come with this fiscal crisis to begin to rethink the way that we invest. And I want to come back and talk about that in a few moments. But that is clearly an opportunity that we have today and a risk. Where does rental housing fit as we begin to rethink our nation's fiscal priorities and the structure of our tax system and so many other things more broadly? Now, I believe strongly that this is an administration that has begun to move on all of these fronts. And I didn't want to take a lot of time today to talk about our accomplishments and what we've done. But I do think it's important to point out that on all of these fronts, we have worked very closely with so many of you here today to make sure that rental housing not only survived this crisis, but could emerge from it strong and meeting the needs of so many families around the country. You obviously know that with the huge decline in financing that was available, the enormous challenges that the CMBS market faced, that FHA multifamily has stepped up to be a critical tool, quintupling in our dollar volume over the last 2 years in multifamily, as well as the role that we have played to ensure that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac could continue to be an important support in the market. We've also obviously stepped in not only on debt, but on the equity side as well. The indications that we got as we stepped into office on what was happening in the low-income housing tax credit market, we saw roughly a 50% decline in the availability of equity for the low-income housing tax credit. And so we worked very closely right from the moment, even through the transition and in the first days of the administration through the Recovery Act, to be able to save the low-income housing tax credit market. Our early indications are that there has been almost no change in the number of units that were allocated in the tax credit. And as the data comes in, we hope they will show that we've continued to be able to produce tax credit units at roughly the same rate as we were before the crisis hit. I also think it's critically important that as we re-envision the role of housing finance and the structure of housing finance in this country, that we have put multifamily housing front and center. Our white paper made the very important point, I think, that first of all, multifamily didn't get us into this crisis. that the multifamily programs at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have continued to perform quite well through the extent of the crisis that we've seen, that they have not contributed to the enormous fiscal challenges at Fannie and Freddie. But also, I think, in some ways more importantly, that because of the nature of multifamily finance, because of the heterogeneity, the incredible variability that we see with markets across the country, that in many ways, having access to a securitization market for multifamily is that much more important than it is for single family. And so that as we have this debate, we've worked very hard to make sure that multifamily has a strong role and rental housing has a strong role in that discussion. In fact, I heard one commentator who will remain nameless say, as we emerged from the conference that we had at Treasury, they'd never heard the word rental housing or multifamily mentioned so many times in one day in the Treasury building in the entire history of that building. And so that is also, I think, a very important piece of what we've done. We've also begun, not only as we focus on ensuring a flow of capital and a continued investment on the federal side in rental housing, that we begin to reimagine our rental housing programs for the 21st century. Whether it's rethinking the way that we fund and support public housing to preserve it for the 21st century, the idea that public housing is the only type of rental housing that's federally supported that doesn't have access to all of the tools that I just described, whether it's debt on the private side, whether it's low-income housing tax credits, or a whole range of other tools, has contributed to isolating public housing in too many communities from the opportunity in the neighborhoods that surround it. And so we've begun a rental assistance demonstration, not only with public housing, but with many legacy programs like RAP and Rent Sup to help connect those to modern tools for housing finance and housing subsidies, but also better connect them to their neighborhoods and to increase mobility in public housing and other forms of assisted housing as well. We've also worked hard to make sure that we can connect all of our housing programs better to their surrounding communities to create mixed income housing. We have a proposal this year to allow, for the first time, low-income housing tax credits to use income averaging so that we can reach deeper into more affordable levels, to reach 30% of median income or below, but at the same time to reach more workforce housing in many communities around the country. We've also worked hard to connect our rental programs to services, whether it's on the homeless side, where we have an unprecedented collaboration of 19 agencies that's produced the first ever federal strategic plan to end homelessness, or the work that we're doing with HHS to gather data on the very deep connection between senior housing costs and Medicaid benefits. Those are key questions that will help us understand how we can both lower the cost to the federal government of housing seniors, but also housing them more closely to their communities and in less intensive settings that will increase their quality of life as well. And finally, the connection between our housing programs and work. And particularly there, I would point out the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, which for too long has been sort of under the radar screen at HUD and hasn't gotten the investment that it needs to be able to raise incomes. The earning disregard is a powerful, powerful tool that, frankly, we've never really studied in depth to be able to see the potential and the power that it has and to give it the investment that it needs. And finally, the connection of rental housing to place that I talked about earlier. We know that in too many places around this country, HUD-assisted housing is contributing to the concentration of poverty. It contributes to the fact that more than 20% of our children live in poverty today, that this nation spends $500 billion a year to help those children. That's 4% of GDP. If we could figure out how to better serve neighborhoods of poverty, to connect them to opportunity, we would not only be able to compete better, to win the future, as the president said, by making sure that every child in this country has a chance to be part of our broader economy, but also that we would better serve the families, the parents who are looking for jobs, dramatically improve schools in those communities if we can focus on those neighborhoods of concentrated poverty. Choice neighborhoods is an important step forward in that debate, working closely with other agencies, Promise Neighborhoods at the Department of Education, community-based health clinics at HHS. We have been able to begin, I think, to lay a platform for rethinking the way the federal government works in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, while also thinking at a broader level of how we connect housing to transportation at the metropolitan level, investing $170 million with the Department of Transportation last year for our Sustainable Communities initiative, something that we want to grow on, that we want to grow and expand on in the years to come. So all of that is a platform for what we've done. But the fact is that we have much work ahead of us, and that is exactly what this conference is about. When, as I said at the outset, we have an opportunity to move this debate into a national conversation, we must think bigger, go farther, and take a series of steps. And so I want to pose, in my last few minutes, a number of challenges to all of you to think about particular areas, ones that we will take on. And I don't come with answers to those. We gather today to have a robust debate about those, but we must, as all of us who care about rental housing, come together and begin to propose large-scale solutions to these challenges that are adequate to the time that we are living in. First of all, as we rethink the housing finance system, we must recognize that what we have invested in rental housing has not been up to the scale of the task. That, quite simply, as we've seen not just over the last few years, but over decades, the challenges of our lowest income deepen, the number of folks living with worst-case housing needs increase over a long period of time. We must find new ways to meet those needs that aren't just about incremental changes in existing programs. It's why we laid out in our white paper the need for a dedicated source of funding for affordable rental housing that is part of the housing finance reform debate. You all know that just as the crisis erupted at Fannie and Freddie, the National Housing Trust Fund got established but has never been funded. We've proposed $1 billion a year each year in our budget to fund that, but that is clearly not adequate to the larger task that we have. We must find new ways that can ensure, while balancing our budget, we continue to invest and provide capital for rental housing. We should also think beyond that. As we begin to discuss the tax code, there's been lots of discussion about the possibility of a renter's credit. What would that look like? Helping us shape what a proposal there would look like, what the costs and benefits of that are, and the balance of policy questions there will be critically important. We also must think about the fact that there are clear gaps in our housing finance system. Most people miss that the largest share of our rental housing in this country is in very small properties. And yet, if you have a 3 or a 4 or a 7 unit property, it's harder to get financing than for a single family house. And that lack of financing, I think we've all seen in neighborhoods around this country, stands in the way of decent, affordable rental housing in so many places. So figuring out how we have a housing finance system that meets those needs, but also more broadly, a regulatory structure and a tax structure, a property tax structure that meets that needs. I saw from my own vantage point in New York City that the most powerful tools we had were often property tax incentives at the local level that helped to ensure those 5 or 10 or 20 unit buildings were well maintained and continued to be a source of decent, affordable rental housing without any direct federal subsidy or investment were critically important. I think we also, as we think about the housing finance system, need to look back at CRA. CRA is a tool that really continues to exist in the 20th century when housing finance has moved beyond it into the 21st century. Bill Apgar and others at the Joint Center have done tremendous work recognizing that as non-bank financial institutions and others have developed, CRA has not kept pace. But there are also a number of issues specifically related to rental housing that are critically important as well. The idea that letters of credit, tax credits, a whole range of sources of financing and funding that are key to rental housing that are not recognized by CRA today or only partially recognized is a critical task that we all should take on as the administration has begun a process of looking at CRA to look at changes and updates to it in the months ahead. I would also say that as this discussion you all had earlier about the effects of place and the location of rental housing, how it connects to local regulatory barriers is absolutely critical. We have to recognize that so much of what drives the development of rental housing, the potential for that development, the cost of that development, has to do with state and local regulatory rules, zoning, and other barriers. And we will not solve the broader workforce rental housing problem that we have if we don't attack those state and local barriers. And yes, there are things that the federal government can do. One of the critical things that our Sustainable Communities program has done is to fund the creation of inclusionary zoning programs, for example, to include the technical assistance that's so often necessary. I remember so often as we were creating inclusionary zoning programs in New York, meeting with local officials from around the country who frankly didn't have the tools, the economic, the financial tools to be able to get the balance right so that inclusionary zoning could increase the production of housing overall while also ensuring a balance of market rate and affordable housing. We have begun to change that with Sustainable Communities. There's even a Native American tribe that is creating its first ever zoning code thanks to a grant from the Sustainable Communities program. There are also ways that we can encourage smart building codes. Bruce Katz has done significant work on ways that the federal government can help to support that. But frankly, there is only so much that we can do. We have begun a broader debate about the ways that our consolidated planning process can be joined up with the regional transportation planning processes to make sure that all of our grants, whether it's CDBG, home, or others, support bringing down those regulatory barriers, creating more cooperation across regions in this country. But frankly, we need the state and local governments across this country to step up, and we need all of you to be a voice to make sure that they are at the table working to help us do that. Finally, I would say that leads to a broader discussion about the political environment that we're in and how we build support for these programs. One of the most satisfying things for me as a cabinet secretary has been to see the way that my colleagues, whether at the Department of Transportation, at the Veterans Administration around veterans homelessness, Secretary Sebelius at HHS, Arne Duncan at Department of Education, all of them understand the fundamental importance of housing to the work that they do. That if there isn't the foundation of a decent, safe place to live, it's going to be difficult for any of them to be successful in the work that they do. And yet, we haven't had those federal partnerships, and I'm proud of the work that we've begun to do to build those relationships and the partnerships at the federal level. But all of you as advocates for rental housing must help us to build an advocacy community that brings together not just those of us in this room today, those of us who have traditionally supported rental housing, but to build a broader tent around these issues. Whether it's institutions of higher learning, chambers of commerce, police departments, child welfare advocates, all of the groups that we might not traditionally see by our side making the case for why rental housing matters. Those are allies that we can and must build links with. And I hope that you will help us to take what we've started to do at the federal level to broaden the tent of support for rental housing. Fundamentally, what my colleagues understand and what those other advocates understand is that the same thing that when I started at the Joint Center got me excited about housing to begin with and brought me to this path that I came down. And that is that when you choose a home, you don't just choose a home. You choose schools for your children. You choose public safety. You choose access to jobs. You choose all of those pieces that are rungs on the ladder to opportunity in this country. And so we must continue to make that case that rental housing is a fundamental building block of opportunity and prosperity in this country. You all know that. Let's make the case to a broader audience that can help build the support to take the big ideas that you all are talking about today to the next level. Thank you.